On the 12th of May 2002, at the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, a small crew of workmen was up on the roof of an enormous assembly building doing repairs. It had been raining for days. A little after 7 in the morning, a long section of the roof gave way and fell more than 200 feet to the floor of the hangar below. 8 of those men were killed, and under the collapsed concrete and steel, crushed flat against the hangar floor, was the only Soviet space shuttle that ever flew. Its name was Buran. 14 years before that roof came down, it had done something no American space shuttle ever did, and something no crew-carrying spacecraft has done since. It flew all the way to orbit, and it brought itself home, onto a runway, in a hard crosswind, with nobody on board. Not one human hand touched the controls, from the moment it left the pad, to the moment the wheels stopped rolling, and then it was towed into that hangar, and it sat there for years, and a roof fell on it. I want to tell you how a machine that good ended up dead under a pile of rubble, because the reason is not the one most people assume, and it is one of the strangest engineering stories the whole Cold War produced. Buran was not killed by a launch failure, and it was not killed by some hidden flaw in the design. It was killed slowly and quietly by a chain of decisions that were each perfectly reasonable when someone made them, and the machine itself was almost an afterthought by the time it died. To see how that happens, you have to go back to why it was built at all, because Buran was built to answer a question, and the question turned out to have the wrong answer. In the middle of the 1970s, the United States was building the space shuttle, and the Soviet Union was trying to figure out what it was actually for. The public story out of America was that the shuttle would make spaceflight cheap and routine, an airliner to orbit that would fly again and pay for itself. Soviet analysts looked hard at that story, and the numbers underneath it did not add up. A reusable shuttle was going to cost more per launch than the ordinary rockets it was meant to replace, not less. The Americans were talking about flying it 60 times a year, and there was nothing on the civilian side, no science, no satellites, that came anywhere close to needing 60 launches a year. So why build it, and why build it that big? The answer they arrived at was that the shuttle had to be military. It could carry an enormous payload up, and unusually, it could carry an enormous payload back down, which is exactly what you would want if you meant to reach out and grab someone else's satellite and bring it home to study. There were plans to fly it out of Vandenberg, on the California coast, into orbits that would carry it right over the Soviet Union. From that kind of orbit, a shuttle could in theory drop a weapon on Moscow faster than any missile the Soviets could see coming. None of that was proven. But if you were sitting in the Soviet Defense Ministry in 1976, looking at a giant American spaceplane whose stated purpose made no economic sense, assuming the worst was not paranoia, it was the job, and so the order went out to build a Soviet answer. What I keep coming back to is how strange this really is. The single most expensive space vehicle the Soviet Union ever built was, in its shape and its whole reason for being, a careful reply to an American machine they were afraid of. They did not copy the shuttle to save face, and they did not copy it because they lacked ideas of their own. They copied its capability because they could not stand to let the other side hold something they could not match. That decision, to build a mirror of a thing you fear, is where the whole story starts to go wrong. And here is what makes it a tragedy instead of a blunder. Every step that followed was defensible. Each one made sense to careful people at the time they made it, and the sum of them was a catastrophe. The first step was the decision to build Buran as a match for a capability, rather than as a tool for a specific job. Built as insurance against an American weapon that was a sound and even a prudent instinct. Built as a machine that would have to find a purpose of its own in order to survive. It was doomed from the first bolt, because no such purpose was ever going to exist. When the Americans built the shuttle, they built the vehicle first, and spent 30 years half-finding missions to fill it. The Soviets did the same thing, except they had even less reason to. They already had Proton and Soyuz, rockets that could put payloads into orbit more cheaply and more simply than any shuttle ever would. There was no cargo that needed Buran, and no orbit that required it, because anything it could do, something cheaper could already do. The engineers who designed it knew all of this, and they built it anyway, brilliantly, because the point was never a particular mission. The point was to hold the capability, so that whatever the Americans turned their shuttle into, the Soviets would not be caught without an answer. What they built to hold that capability was staggering, and this is the second step, the one that could never be undone. Buran did not carry its own main engines the way the American shuttle did. Instead, it rode on top of a separate super-heavy rocket called Energia. a genuine monster of a launcher that could throw more than 100 tons into orbit on its own, with or without a shuttle bolted to its side. Around that, they built an entire parallel world. A runway long enough and precise enough to land an orbiter automatically. Vast assembly buildings out on the steppe. A fleet of orbiters in various stages of construction. They even built the largest airplane in history, the giant 6-engined Antonov, for the single purpose of carrying pieces of this program across the country. By the time it was canceled, the state had poured something like 20 billion rubles into it. A threat assessment can be quietly revised later if it turns out to be wrong. 20 billion rubles of concrete and steel and rocket cannot be unpoured. And by the mid-1980s, there was an enormous amount of it sitting out on the steppe. Notice how the ground hardens as you go down this chain. The first decision was a judgment call, and judgment calls can be argued about and reversed. By the time you have built the rocket, and the runway, and the hangars, and the airplane, and half a fleet of orbiters, the program is no longer a decision. It is a fact on the ground with a momentum of its own, employing tens of thousands of people, defended by everyone whose career now depends on it. And it was carrying all of that weight toward a single date, a single flight, that was supposed to prove the whole thing had been worth it. That flight came on the 15th of November, 1988. In the dark of the early morning, Buran lifted off from Baikonur on top of the Energia rocket, with nobody on board and every system running on its own software. It climbed to orbit, circled the Earth twice, a little over 80,000 kilometers, in about 3.5 hours, and then it turned itself around and came home. And what happened in the last few minutes is the part I find genuinely remarkable, still, after reading everything I could find about it. Coming down toward the runway, in a crosswind of better than 60 kilometers an hour, the orbiter suddenly swung off the approach that everyone on the ground was expecting. It made extra turns, it flew out past the field and came back around from the other side. For a few seconds, the people watching thought the machine had lost its mind. It had not. Its own software had looked at the wind and the speed and quietly decided that the safe way down was the opposite approach, and it flew that instead, and it put its wheels on the concrete within about 3 meters of the center line, in a crosswind, with an empty cabin, on the first and only time it was ever tried. Here is what that flight actually was, and it is the hinge the whole story turns on. On the day Buran flew perfectly, the reason it existed was already gone. The American shuttle had been flying for 7 years by then, and it had not become the weapon the Soviet analysts had feared. It launched satellites and science labs, and it repaired telescopes. After the Challenger disaster, the plan to fly it out of Vandenberg over the Soviet Union was quietly shelved, and the West Coast shuttle site was mothballed without ever launching a thing. The giant threat that had justified Buran, the whole reason to pour 20 billion rubles into a mirror of the American machine, had simply failed to appear. The machine worked, the mission did not. Buran flew its flawless flight into a world that no longer had any need of it, and everyone technical enough to understand the program understood that, even as they celebrated, and there was nothing anyone could do with that fact, which is the cruel part. None of the things the program had going for it could touch the problem. The engineering was as good as anything on Earth, and it did not matter, because you cannot engineer your way to a mission that does not exist. The money was already spent and could not be called back. The people were among the best in the world, and all their brilliance could not conjure the one thing Buran had never had, which was a job that only it could do. The orbiter came down onto that runway in November of 1988 as the most capable machine of its kind ever built, and it had, by then, nowhere to go. So the machine itself lasted until 2002, when the roof came down on it. But the program it belonged to was really finished back in 1988. In the same month, it flew its one perfect flight. Everything that happened in between was a beautiful, hideously expensive object, waiting for a reason to fly that was never going to come. What happened in between was a slow, decent, and completely doomed attempt to keep it alive. After the first flight, the people running the program faced a fork, and both roads were defensible. One road was to admit, right there, in 1988, that the strategic reason for Buran had evaporated, and to cancel it while the celebration was still warm. That was the more honest road, and some people argued for it. The other road was to keep the program going, and go looking for a purpose, any purpose, that could justify what had been built. Fly cargo to the Mir space station, launch commercial satellites for hard currency, keep the fleet in construction, and wait for the world to hand Buran a mission. They took the second road, because after 20 billion rubles and a perfect flight, walking away felt insane, but the world was moving the other direction, fast. The Soviet economy was coming apart, and a space shuttle with no mission is the easiest line in the entire budget to cut. A second flight, meant to carry cosmonauts, was planned and then postponed, and then never happened. The program was suspended for lack of money. In 1991, the country that had ordered Buran built stopped existing, and there is the honest core of the argument for killing it. As the state fell apart, every rubble kept in a shuttle it did not need was a rubble not spent on things it desperately did. That argument was true. It was not cynical or short-sighted, just correct, and being correct is exactly what ended the program. In 1993, Boris Yeltsin signed the order that formally canceled Buran for good. And then comes the part that is almost too stupid to be tragic. The orbiters did not get museums. They got mothballed, rolled into the assembly buildings at Baikonur, and left there, in a country that no longer had the money to look after them, in a place where the winters are brutal and the summers bake. The one that had flown, the real one, the one that had brought itself home in that crosswind, sat inside a hangar called Site A112. That building had first been raised to assemble the giant N1 moon rocket back in the 1960s, and it was handed to the shuttle program after the moon rocket was canceled. It was already old, and nobody kept it up. The maintenance money was gone with everything else, and year after year, the roof took on rain and snow, and no one attended to it. In May of 2002, after days of heavy rain, with a repair crew up on top trying to fix the very thing that was failing, it came down. There was no fire on the launch pad, and no failure in the sky. What killed the only Soviet shuttle that ever flew was a neglected roof, a few days of rain, and gravity, along with 8 men who had nothing to do with any of the grand decisions and everything to do with the small one nobody had made, which was to keep the building from falling down. So here is why Buran actually died. There are 5 reasons, and I want to go through them in order, because the order is part of what makes it so bleak. The first reason, and the largest, is timing. The machine outlived its purpose, and it outlived it by the widest possible margin, because the purpose was gone before the machine ever flew. Buran was built to counter a threat, and by the time it reached orbit, the people who built it already understood that the threat was not coming. A capability built to answer a specific danger has a clock running on it from the day the danger fades, and for Buran, that clock had already run out by the time it reached orbit. The second is that it never had a mission of its own, and that one was structural, the kind of thing no amount of effort could have fixed. When you build a machine to match a rival rather than to do a defined job, you inherit a machine with nothing to do the instant the rivalry ends. Proton and Soyuz were already lifting what the Soviet Union actually needed to lift, more cheaply and more reliably than a shuttle ever could. There was no work waiting for Buran that something else was not already doing better. The question it had been built to answer had simply stopped being asked. Third comes the cost, set against a state that was about to stop existing. Buran was not a machine so much as an entire industrial world, the rocket and the runway and the hangars and the airplane and the fleet, and a world that large only stays standing as long as an enormous national budget holds it up. When the money ran out and then the state itself dissolved, everything the program needed to survive went with it. The fourth reason is concentration, and it is the one that is simply stupid. The single orbiter that had actually flown was reduced to one airframe, parked in one aging building with no upkeep. Everything was in one basket, and the basket had a bad roof. It did not take a disaster to destroy the only proof that Buran had ever worked. It took a maintenance budget that was not there, and one more rainy spring than the building could take. And the fifth reason belongs to the people who started the whole thing, and it is the one I most want to be fair about. The Soviet analysts who feared the American shuttle were not fools, and they were not warmongers inventing an enemy. They were reading real anomalies in the American program, the launch rate that made no sense, the payload that could come back down, the plan to fly over their heads from California, and they drew a defensible conclusion from strange facts. The threat they prepared for simply never arrived. That does not make the decision to prepare for it a careless one. They built the most careful possible answer to a danger that any responsible person, looking at what they were looking at, would have taken seriously. Which is the whole point, and it is why I cannot hand you a villain, no matter how much a story like this seems to want one. Look at who is actually in it. The engineers built a machine that did something no one has matched before or since. The analysts read a real threat out of real evidence. The officials who finally canceled it were making the only responsible choice left to a country that was falling apart around them. Even the men on the roof were doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing, which was trying to fix it. Not one of them was a fool, and not one of them set out to break anything. Every single decision, taken on its own, in its own moment, was reasonable. It is only when you lay them end to end that you see them add up to a crushed spaceplane under a fallen roof. There is one part of this I cannot tidy up, and I am not going to try. The 8 men who died in that hangar are not a footnote to a story about rockets. Their deaths had nothing to do with spaceflight, and everything to do with a building nobody had the money to maintain, and no amount of admiring the machine underneath them makes that better. And the other thing that does not resolve is that the capability Buran proved in 1988, a large winged spacecraft flying itself all the way home with an empty cabin, is still not something we casually trust with human lives. It was demonstrated once, and then it was buried, and in some real sense we have been slowly reinventing pieces of it ever since. The lesson I take from all of it is about the difference between a capability and a purpose, and it has a number attached. The American shuttle that Buran was built to mirror flew more than 100 times across 30 years, and it flew that often, for better and for worse, because it had missions, contested and expensive and sometimes deadly, but real. Buran flew once. That was all of it. One flight, and then it was finished. The machine itself was not the problem. It just did not have a single job that belonged to it, and to nothing else. So the moment the rivalry that created it faded, there was no reason left to send it up at all. Capability without a purpose is not an asset held in reserve. It is a debt, and the bill comes due the moment the reason you built it goes away. The step at Baikonur is still there, and it launches rockets to this day. Soyuz capsules lift off from pads not far from where Buran flew, carrying crews to orbit the old, reliable way. The enormous runway they built to catch a shuttle out of the sky is still out there on the flat, mostly empty now, too long for anything that uses it. The world went on and found other ways to get to space, but the machine that landed itself in that crosswind is gone. It was not beaten by any failure of its own. It did everything it was built to do, and it did it perfectly, and that turned out to be the whole problem, because once it had, there was nothing left for it to be. You can still go and see a Buran if you want to. There are airframes in Moscow and elsewhere that people visit and photograph, but the ones you can walk up to never flew. They are test articles and stand-ins, shells that were used for ground trials and never left the Earth. The one that actually went to orbit and brought itself home is the one that was inside Site 112, and it is still there, in pieces, under a roof that no one ever rebuilt. To this day, no space shuttle and no crew-carrying spaceplane from any country has repeated what that machine did on its first and only try, which was to fly to orbit and land itself on a runway with the cabin empty. The deeper lesson, I think, is that we tell ourselves the great machines die because something breaks, and mostly they do not. They die like this one did, long after the thing that gave them meaning is already gone, kept alive out of pride and sunk cost, until some small, dumb, human failure finishes what indifference started. Buran was never really beaten by the American shuttle at all. What beat it was outliving its own reason to exist, and then, years later, a leaky roof over a building nobody had the money to save. If you find yourself wanting more stories like this one, the abandoned machines and the buried programs and the brilliant work that got left to rot for reasons that had nothing to do with the work, then subscribe, because the history of the space age is full of them, and most of them are stranger and more human than the versions you were handed. I will keep digging them up, and I will keep telling them the way they actually happened. Subscribe, and I will see you at the next one.